It's once again Orktober, and what better way to celebrate this most festive of seasons than with my favorite hobby pastime: converting. And this year, I'm finally tackling a project that's been sitting on my bench since our last big Gorkamorka campaign almost 6 years ago. Now, if you'll excuse me, today is the 1st of Orktober, which means I'm going to really have to get moving if I hope to get my next project done in just 13 months for Orktober 2025. I bet you guys thought I was joking when I said I needed 13 months to finish my next Gorkamorka project. Yep, definitely wasn't supposed to be a joke at the time. But here we are. Or rather, there we were, since it took me another week after Orktober to finish the video. Correction, it took 5 weeks. I have been working on nerd projects during the past year, though it hasn't been so much of a constant effort as the occasional frantic marathon of a project amid work and life. I also wasn't focusing on just one Gorkamorka project, because I always underestimate the amount of time it will actually take me on a project when I'm not inadvertently making an accurate assessment while trying to be funny. Fortunately, Howl has been killing it with her Orky conversions the last few weeks, which gave me the motivation to pull myself across the finish line and fix my broken buggy. Gorkamorka vehicles come in a few sizes: bike, buggy, and truck, and in 2 basic flavors: wheeled or tracked. My Gorka mob went all tracks, which seemed appropriate for an eccentric band of spanner boys. But this created a slight complication later on in the campaign when I had enough teeth to get a 3rd vehicle. While there were a few different truck-sized big tracks you could get through the Forge World at the time, Games Workshop only had one buggy-sized track model, the War Trakk, which was modeled after half-track motorcycles like the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 2 Kettenkrad. While I loved the quirky design of the War Trakk, I didn't want to just have 2 of the same design, so I decided to convert my second one to have a layout closer to that of the wheeled Ork buggy. I also wanted the second track to be armed with a Scorcha, so I wanted to base its design after my favorite vehicle in Mad Max Fury Road, Firecar Mk I. Such a great car. I'm glad it got so much screen time. The basic idea of the conversion was to widen it a bit, to make it boxier and to give it 2 wheels in the front, putting the driver in a seat. Then build the rest of the car as a pretty sparse frame around a bunch of oil drums and a supercharged engine, just like the little fire car from Mad Max. After tearing apart a War Trakk I bought on eBay, I didn't really have much of a frame to attach them to. In the end, I ended up building a sort of scaffolding around the upright barrels and then pinning the angled barrels directly to the other 2. Building the barrels into this tiny modern art piece instead of just cutting them in half and gluing them to flat surfaces was both way more work than I'd planned and quite a bit bigger than I'd expected. Since this counted as buggy-sized, I didn't want to stretch the track any longer, so I ended up just pushing it up higher, and a little bit wider. I also ended up scrapping the engine block, which was a shame. Once I finally had everything mostly assembled, I had 2 main sub-assemblies, the front and the back, as well as some smaller bits to glue together after painting. The 2 I-beams on the cab fit snugly around the 2 front barrels and extended most of the way through the interior of the rear section, making the finished vehicle fairly solid once it was glued together. I'm sure I carefully measured the width of the cab at some point during its construction, but since the project was stretched out over the course of months, I was actually quite surprised at how perfectly it all fit together when the 2 halves were finally completed. Despite ending up a bit taller and wider than I'd originally intended, I was pretty pleased with how the conversion worked out. I managed to keep its length within about 5mm of the standard War Trakk, which isn't bad for the amount of scratch building I ended up doing. There were, of course, a few things that I wasn't totally satisfied with. The front fenders were a bit underwhelming. The weapon mount put the Scorch above the gunner's head, and despite being quite tall, it didn't really feel that boxy. See, look at this guy, so cute. Also, a 5-year-old whose hobbies included vehicles and taking things apart got a hold of this one and somehow lost one of the wheels. His hobbies also include pushing all the buttons on unattended electronics.
Hi.
One of the reasons I kept the same wheels is because they were one of the standard 40K wheel sizes, which meant you could easily order replacements from Games Workshop. But then GW stopped selling them, so I had to come up with a different plan. To replace the wheels on my little fire car, I eventually landed on the wheels from the Gene Stealer Colt's Achilles Ridge Runner. Of course, no wheels were going to fit my existing model perfectly, but these ones were quite a bit bigger, which would require some redesigning. I didn't want the whole vehicle to tilt backwards, so I'd have to elevate the rear enough that it tilted forward instead. To do this, I decided to build my little Trakk a proper undercarriage, like the one on our big sister. The first step was cutting some long plasticard strips, which I did using a paper cutter. It does work perfectly on plasticard, especially plasticard this thick, but it did a much better and faster job than I could do with a ruler and a knife. I then cut those long strips into the parts for the basic frame of the vehicle. I used some plasticard H-beams to make the main side frames. The next step was to start chopping up the old fire car. I got a bit overzealous with my dismantling and ended up ripping off a few parts that didn't actually need to be replaced. Oops. For my car's new transmission, I decided to use part of a soap dispenser. It is about the right shape, but comically large for a vehicle of this size. But I decided to use it anyway, because that seemed pretty orky. The Ridge Runner wheels are designed to fit snugly onto their axles, but I wanted to put some brass rods in mine to make them detachable. There's not a practical or game-related reason to do this. I just like being able to take the wheels off my vehicles. So this meant a lot of careful, very fiddly drilling into both the axles and the wheels. Although it made drilling really hard, the detailed axle and suspension on the Ridge Runner is pretty cool. It's barely even visible on the actual model, but as a converter, I'm glad Games Workshop modelers put the effort into making all these great bits. I was thinking about scratch building an engine block for my Trakk, but then I remembered that I already had a very orky engine block from the Ork Mk I workshop that I used to build part of the fort. I just had to carefully snip away the chains meant to hold it up, and it was ready to go. Easiest modification of the whole build. A somewhat more difficult modification was required when I decided that while I was building the undercarriage, I might as well add a mount for a ram. Unfortunately, I didn't really plan for this when I was building the frame, and I didn't want to make the vehicle any longer, which meant I had to carve a big notch into some pretty sturdy plastic beams. Fortunately, I had a shortcut. You certainly don't need a miniature belt sander for converting minis, but it sure is a handy solution for poor planning. Sanding such a small part so precisely wasn't easy, and even on my sander, I had to brace the buggy frame on a 1-2-3 block while sanding. Also, I took this opportunity to sand down the base of the weapon mount. Apparently, I filled the entire thing with green stuff when I built it, so by the time it was down to the height I wanted, the entire room was covered in green dust. Anyway, sending down the H-beams on the frame gave me a great connection between the ram mount and the rest of the undercarriage, so I wouldn't have to worry about it getting broken if the model got bumped with the ram attached. And now that my weapons mount was shorter, it was time to rebuild the gunner's platform that I destroyed earlier. Since most of the surface area on the bottom of the mount was the solid green stuff core, I attached it to the plastic card platform with super glue. The platform kind of floated above the rest of the vehicle at this point, so I didn't want it to look like the gunner was just surfing on a thin sheet of plastic card. I decided that the way to go was to give the platform some thickness, so I used some square tubing to basically turn it into a low box, which I guess works. I didn't really know where I was going with the platform at this point, so I probably just should have left the old one more intact. Oh well. I also added some diamond plate plastic card to the top surface. We wouldn't want the gunner slipping after all. The next step in the conversion was attaching my big goofy transmission to the frame of the track. Not only was this connection using whatever type of plastic the soap dispenser was made out of, the connection point is just the line where the edge of two H-beams touches the curve of a cylinder. I suppose I could have fashioned some sort of elaborate mounting system, but this build was already plenty crazy, so I just stuck it together with a copious amounts of superglue and baking soda. Next, I had to figure out how to hook the tracks together. On the standard war track, the tracks just glued right into the wheel wells on the side of the body, but I was going to need some actual axles. They did have some little nubs where an axle would be, so I cut some bits of plastic card tube with my nifty little jig. Since I was working with all plastic parts, I could just connect everything together with plastic glue, which was nice. The nubs would serve not only as a connection point between the tracks and the axles, but between the tracks and the rest of the buggy. Also, since the top inside part of the tracks was the part where you glued it to the body of the war track, there wasn't a detailed model on that spot, so I covered it up by gluing it to some more H-beams. Since the axles were going to be long and exposed, I opted to make them out of brass tube so that they'd be less likely to bend or break. Brass tube can be kind of a pain to cut. I even bought a special cutter specifically for that job, but it didn't work on the small gauge of tubing used in modeling. Fortunately, a razor saw and my little cutting jig made short work of the brass rods and tubes, though I'm sure it wears my saw blades out quite a bit faster than plastic card. The next thing my axles needed was a differential to connect them to the rest of the powertrain. I ended up going with part of a little plastic twist-off cap. This is the type of cap they used to have on old Squeeze-It bottles, though this one was from some medication. I poked some holes in the side and ran the axle through, leaving the original hole to connect to the drive shaft. With the plastic joints already in place, gluing in the axles was pretty easy. The only thing I had to do was make sure that I got everything glued together as square as possible. Of course, while the brass axles themselves were pretty strong, I didn't want those plastic joints supporting all the shearing stress on the bottom of the vehicle, so I cut some plastic card I-beams to connect the two sides, basically turning the track assembly into its own subframe. It's a little bit harder to cut I-beams with my jig, but it's still by far the easiest and most precise way to do it. Connecting I-beams at right angles can also be a bit tricky, but if you just cut off the top and bottom of one of them so that they lock together tightly, you end up with a really great connection. While most of the undercarriage construction came together quite nicely, not everything I did ended up working. While I knew after getting my front tires that I'd have to lower the rear tracks to compensate, I didn't really have a solid vision of how I was going to do that. So at some point, I decided I needed to construct some elaborate side skirting for the tracks that would attach them to the main chassis of the vehicle. The challenge was that I didn't want to make my buggy any wider than it was before, so whatever I built the supporting structure for these side skirts out of would have to be thin. Also, since I was going to all the trouble of using these old 4-track tracks, I didn't want to completely cover them up. In the end, I decided to build them out of plastic guard I-beams and paper clips. Paper clips are a pain to work with, but they are really good for things like pinning because they're incredibly sturdy. Well, it sounds like it should make them a decent option for building structural components like this. The whole thing ended up being way too fiddly, so I scrapped the idea. Instead, all the connection points would have to be on the beams the tracks were attached to. To finish the new undercarriage for my track, I now had to connect the two subframes. I decided to do this by modeling some pistons to look like a hydraulic suspension or adjustable traction bars. This would involve connecting tubes at some weird angles, so I started off by using some other bits of tube to make some connection points on the main portion of the frame. These little mounts just had to stick up beyond the flanges of the beams they were attached to. The nice thing about building hydraulics and pistons and such is that they're pretty easy to scratch build as long as you have the right sizes of plastic card tube. On the track subframe, I decided I wanted some brackets that the supports would actually snap into. So I decided to make some little C-shaped brackets by clipping one face off a section of square tube. 4 little tubes at askew angles wasn't very much to support the weight of the entire vehicle, especially if someone pressed down on it. So I decided I needed a connection point between the frames that went straight up and down. My initial plan was to create 2 more, even smaller pistons to squeeze into the spot between the 2 frames, but they were just way too flimsy. Instead, I decided to create some springs out of some plastic worm gears. This meant that I could run some brass rod through the middle of the gears and solidly pin the 2 halves together. The hard part was cutting the worm gears at an angle to match the upper frame. I took a picture of the gear and the frames with my phone, and then tried to match the angle by eyeballing it with my razor saw. If this looks impossible, this is what it looked like from my perspective. Yeah, you try cutting at a precise 10-degree angle through a piece of plastic that just wants to spin around every time you saw into it. But I did manage to get it close enough, so then I just had to glue the whole thing together. The final result looked really good too. I didn't even drill the holes that straight if you look too closely, but it still managed to work really well. The next step was the little suspension bars. I clipped one end into the little C-clamps on the track subframe so I could move them around as I extended them up to the right height to connect to the mounts on the main chassis. This plan worked a lot better in my head. It's really hard to adjust something this carefully when there's not enough space to really get your fingers in there. And even though all these parts were plastic, I opted for super glue and baking soda because I needed that instant bond if I wanted any of them to stay in place. It took a lot of fiddling around, but eventually I got them all connected. It wasn't perfect, but it did the job. The last step for the undercarriage was just putting in a drive shaft between the transmission and the differential. This bit was a bit further up there above the axles, so I was able to just use a small bit of plastic guard rod, which was much easier to install than all the structural components I'd been dealing with. So now my little Trek has a proper undercarriage with fancy new front wheels. And the whole thing's surprisingly solid. I guess it's time to rewind a little bit and go over some of the conversions on the body of the track. When last we saw our gunner's platform, it had just been chunkified, so now I needed some panels around the edges to hide the layers of plastic art inside. I didn't get them on particularly straight, but it's all good. While I was improving the spot for the gunner, I decided I'd do the same for the driver by magnetizing his seat. In Gorkamorka, drivers get chucked out of their vehicles on a fairly regular basis, so it's a good idea to make them removable. The cab of my little Firecar is built around parts from the Ork Trakk kit, so I have to try and slot them into the little holes every time I put them in the car, so magnets will make things much easier. I tried to sort of grind down a spot for the magnet using a flathead bit in my drill, which sort of worked. It mostly just scratched off the paint, but that was enough that I could use plastic glue, because I encased my magnets in plastic. I'll have to talk more about that sometime when my video isn't already running super long. On the driver's seat, I didn't bother with the drill and just scraped the paint off with an X-Acto knife. I then lined up both magnets in the cab and carefully put my driver into position. Huzzah! Magnetizing my driver made taking him in and out so much easier. His butt magnet also meant that I could have him sit just about anywhere I wanted. I also cut some more diamond plate to fix the very back of the buggy, where I'd made some spots for 2 more mobsters to hang on. I'd had diamond plate on there before, but it looks like I added it after the model had been painted, so it popped off pretty easily during my over-exuberant disassembly. This time, I sanded off the primer to make a better connection. I also kind of mangled the whole middle section, so in order to attach the new gunner's platform, I needed to add some supports. And then I could glue on the platform. As I was gluing on some more supports, I decided to use a piece of tube for one of them as a mounting point for gubbins like a big grabba or wrecking ball. I then added some more panels to close off this back portion. I also added a little slightly modified Lego steering wheel to the cab for the driver. And I added some little controls from the Flash Kits set as controls for the gubbins. Another common feature you see in the studio conversions and in the artwork are roll cages around the driver, so I thought I'd make one for my little buggy as well. I first made a little paper pattern to measure the size of the cab before I chopped up my plastic art rod. Having the pattern and being able to assemble the cage as a standalone unit made the process much easier. It also made the sanding much easier. I've cut most of it out of this video, but like half the time I spent on this project was just sanding things. The final major change I wanted to make in this conversion was to finally add the engine block that I wasn't able to make the first time. So, rewinding again to the part where I just realized I'd ripped off way too much of the original Firecar. I then decided that I should cut a big hole in the back to build a mount for the engine. Like many parts of this conversion, I had a vague idea of what I wanted to do, but not a detailed plan. Originally, I thought I'd have the engine block inset into the rear platform to make it mostly line up with the rest of the powertrain, hence the big hole. That idea went out the window as soon as I started building my crazy lifted undercarriage. I ended up taking a lot of inspiration from the crazy engine configurations you see at tractor pulls. You can have multiple engines offset by different horizontal and vertical amounts, because all their shafts meet in the same gearbox that transfers power down to the main shaft. You also see a lot of these big clean panels below the engines for displaying logos and such, so I thought I'd go for something like that. Also, if you ever thought your Orky vehicle was too ridiculous or too unrealistic, go watch Tractor Pull. Anyway, I forgot how absolutely riddled with supports this little section of the track was, but by sheer luck I managed to cut my hole in a spot between them all. I started building the gearbox thing out of plastic art, and since I was going for the shiny Tractor Pull paneled look, I basically just had to build a box. To connect that to the body of the vehicle, I decided to use some parts from a disposable razor. As I was getting ready to glue these two parts together, I thought, I could just glue them. Or I could magnetize them and make my engine detachable. Are there situations in Gorkamorka where your engine gets removed? Absolutely not. Is there an in-game reason to swap out your engine? Also no. So I got to work magnetizing my engine block. All I had to do was drill a hole in the little mount I just built. But this ended up being way more difficult than I'd expected. The razor had a big support ring down the middle that would deflect the drill to one side or the other, so I had to just hack the whole thing apart and dig out the parts that were getting in the way. The one nice thing is, since I had to glue a new piece of plastic art on top, I could just put the magnet in there before I sealed it up again. To get the magnet into this little slot I'd made for it, facing the right direction, I had to put another magnet on the backside to guide it in. If you're having trouble, you can use lots of magnets. Magnetizing the gearbox was relatively easy, because I could just move the box and the magnet into the position I wanted and glue the magnet right there. Then I thought, hey, that wasn't so bad. While I'm at it, I could just magnetize all the crew platforms, so I magnetized the crew platforms. I stuck the magnets to little patches, so once they're painted, they'll just look like some kind of Orky repair job. Anyway, back to the engine. I put some little plastic hard corners on the gearbox to cover up the seams and give the box a bit more structural support. I then moved on to the exhaust pipes, which I built out of plastic hard rod. Making a bunch of tightly interconnected tubes is pretty difficult, let alone making two symmetrical sets, so I decided to glue them to some little guides to help me get them straight. I could then file the whole thing down as one piece to get the correct angle to connect to the engine block. Once they were filed down, I also cut and filed off as much of the guide as I could. Sweet. I then reattached my Orky mufflers to my new exhaust pipes, and the engine was done. The last step before painting was adding the little details like rivets, vents, and wires. This was also when I remembered that I needed to build some new fenders. Got out my big clippers for this one. Although the fenders had some precise angles like the exhaust, it's a lot easier to work with flat sheets than a handful of miniature cylinders. Also, as with the exhaust, remember that you're making mirrored versions so you don't end up with two left fenders. Once it was all glued together, I cut off the excess. To avoid the plasticky look of my old fenders, I spent a lot of time sanding these ones to hide the joints. I also added some trim around the edges. The trim also got sanded. I then attached the new fenders right where the old ones had been. And I added a bunch of super glue and baking soda to make sure that they weren't going to come off. and the fenders also got rivets. Finally, I thought I'd make some wrappings from green stuff to go around part of the roll cage, like you often see on Ork vehicles. I rolled out a couple of different strips and just picked the best one. Also, despite it curing for over an hour, it was still a bit too soft to work with, so I started mushing back together and had to sculpt the detail back in with a knife. Oh well. Before I stuck the undercarriage to the body, I wanted to base coat all the hard to reach details. So I masked out the areas where they'd be glued together, and a few areas where I thought I'd keep the original paint. The next step was to start airbrushing. The next step was to clean my airbrush. Oh shit. The next step was to find my airbrush nozzle. And after sweeping my kitchen for 3 hours, I did! So now the next step was airbrushing. I was so excited that my airbrush was working that I forgot how gravity works. After doing a poor job of cleaning that up, I made everything silver. The paint job turned out pretty good. I also painted the magnet on the driver. So now it was time to glue the body to the undercarriage. Which went pretty well. The first step was to paint the remaining exposed bits of plastic with my black primer and Vallejo silver, which was a bit of a pain. I also had to touch up a bit of the overspray on the tires and the belts, and a few other non-metallic bits with the same paint. I also gave the wrappings a black undercoat. Fortunately, and in contrast to my Ford, the color palette of my mob is pretty limited, especially if you don't have to paint skin. First up was base coating the red, which I did with Mephiston Red. I then based the black bits using the same primer that I'd used before. I then went in and painted some of the smaller red details. Then I based the wraps with Rackar's flesh. I also used that to base the areas where I wanted to add checks. For the brass bits, I gave them a coat of Balthazar gold. I then brightened up the red bits with a coat of Evil Sun's Scarlet. painted the magnets for the driver's seat with lead belcher. And I also picked out the rivets that got painted over with more silver. And I picked out some yellow details with Everland Sunset. Then I did some edge highlights with Wild Rider Red. I was originally planning on masking this part to get a nice straight line between the red and the checks, but I somehow nailed it just freehanding and just kept going. So not everything I did on this conversion was painfully slow trial and error. I also painted some checks on my tractor pull engine panels, and cleaned up the overspray on the front of the track. I also added some highlights to the yellows, and added some hazard stripes. The cloth wrappings got a wash of Agrax Earthshade to darken the folds, and then another layer of Rakarth flesh to brighten up the flat areas. And as a final detail, I painted my shocks red so that you could actually see them all the way up in there. The first step in weathering was stippling on some dark rust patches, using the same method I used for the fort. Fortunately, it was easy to get up inside the wheel wells because I made the wheels detachable. It was also easy to get behind, or rather in front of, the engine block. The tracks on my track got a pretty heavy dry brush of rust as well. While they were off, I also gave my tires a dry brush of Eschen Grey, and gave the other rubber bits a highlight. I then went back in with a lighter rust color for some variation. Now that the undercarriage was attached, painted, and weathered, I could also attach the little shocks that came with the Ridge Runner wheels. I gave them a coat of primer, painted them red to match the other shocks, and then had to try and wedge them into the slot they were supposed to fit into. Then I tried to glue them in with super glue, and they popped loose again. But once I eventually got them glued in, I was on to an even more intimidating step. If you watch the videos of the construction of my Gorkamorka fort, then you'll know that one of my biggest setbacks was the watered down spirits that ate through my paint. But surely now that I had decent mineral spirits, I shouldn't have any more trouble, right? Yeah, actually it went just fine. I used the same mix of roughly 1 part oil paints to 4 parts spirits, and slathered it all over the metallic parts. I then wiped most of it off using a makeup sponge. I also used a Q-tip and mineral spirits to clean off some of the small and hard to reach details. It mostly worked just fine, but I did inadvertently damage a few bits. I was a bit too rough on the cable I made from a piece of paperclip, because I forgot that cotton swabs are actually pretty abrasive if you scrub back and forth with them. And while galvanized steel makes paperclips good for pinning things in place, paint doesn't stick to it that great. I also wore off a bit of paint on the front shocks and on the edge of a tire. That one, I don't know, because I just wiped it on a sponge. But I guess I rubbed it extra hard or something? Fortunately, repainting those bits in the same colors was pretty easy. Redoing the stripes was a bit of a pain, but fortunately it was only like a centimeter's worth of cable. Since I was touching up mistakes, I decided to lighten up the wrappings with some Karak stone. I also decided I didn't like the red handle on the gubbins, so I painted it brown. I also decided I didn't like the brown handle on the gubbins, so I painted it gray. Next, I added some dust to the tires, treads, and platforms with a dry brush of Talarn sand and a shop debone. And finally, I added a bit more rust to the track with some dirty down rust. Which I tidied up with some water. Oh, and I also added a magnet to my spanner toast, so he'd stick to the gunner's platform. Now I'm done. So my little Orky Firecar is finally finished, and she's as cute and boxy as the car that inspired her. I didn't add any length, so she's still just slightly longer than the War Track. Plus, she's already set up to be equipped with gubbins like a big grabba, wrecking ball, or a ram. Though this ram is ridiculous, I need to make a more appropriately sized one. Also, I completely rebuilt the gimbal for my heavy weapons mount, but that could be its own whole video. So it will be. Oh, also, after I decided to magnetize my engine block, I completely forgot about the huge exhaust pipe sticking off the back. So I ended up having to add 2 little pins to actually hold it in there. Which works. It was just an extra step. But it wasn't too bad. If you take anything away from this video, hopefully it's that while it's helpful to have a plan going into conversion, you can kind of make it up as you go along. Sometimes you'll make mistakes, but there's nothing you can't fix with some time and effort. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Relatively soon.